intelligencesquared.com.
Thank you. It's rather good that we got to the point about economics, and after all, it is all economics. I'm not going to just repeat what a famous person once said, but it is the economy and economics stupid, almost. I'm repeating that quote. And that's really the crux of the matter. So let me just remind ourselves how we got here and why this motion is really quite important. Climate change, which is, of course, a sort of recent concern of all of us humans, is really like a shock to the economy. And it's an external shock. It's a sort of thing that requires quite a lot of response, which was, of course, the whole thing was unanticipated before it came. Of course, it was all happening, but we hadn't quite noticed it. And then economists actually started talking about it and putting some value and price to it. And everyone woke up, so superimposed on the science. And I think that's very good news. Having said that, it's also very bad news, because basically there is an inability by governments to respond to shocks of this nature in particular. They don't take a long-term view. They can't agree. I mean, look what's going on in Europe right now. Given that there is an inability to deal with crisis anyway. They have been inclined to kick it all to the long grass. There is huge inability to price externalities properly. Individual countries' welfare functions vary hugely. The sort of intergenerational discount rate is a subject of a huge debate in this country, and we can actually influence the rest of the world. But I think it's going to be very difficult for us to convince the Chinese to worry particularly about the next generation while they're still, and the one after, while they're still struggling to grow. Then we have a serious problem about the population, certainly in the Western world, being used to cheap energy, in the emerging markets being used to hugely subsidized energy. Companies then complaining to any energy minister in relation to international competitiveness, should you start putting prices up? So basically, one is in a no-win situation. If you look at individual countries, why should they be the ones to start first? But there are some ways in which you can use economics to get to the right place. You can let markets find the way, as long as you set some parameters, of course. Let's say agreed emission targets, and make sure that operators respond and produce that reduction in the least costly way, which is a must in economics. Or you can set volume controls, of course, over defined periods and allow trading mechanisms, or even better, which is what economists would go for, have a general carbon tax, and then wait for the markets to find their way. You may not get the carbon tax right, and then you may need to adjust it. But at least you have started doing so. What you could do, which is wrong, is to start fixing the shares of the types of energy generation that you want the country to have, because that immediately gives the operators quite a lot of bargaining power. And that leads also to subsidies to achieve that, which distort the market. And many governments have made that mistake. But in all those possibilities that exist in terms of getting it not necessarily right, but approaching something better than what we have now, is through international agreements. But of course, with Cancun and Copenhagen having failed to make anything binding, new countries are struggling in what they can do. And then they react by doing things like imposing renewable targets, which of course then completely confuse what is going on in the carbon market itself, as we have seen in Europe. But I think that in this environment that we have, which is confused and diverse in terms of responses, international diplomacy is an absolute must, particularly in relation to trying to think a bit more clearly about what the global industrial policy might need to be to achieve the aims. So my contention is that nothing much can be achieved in acting alone, and China, rapidly becoming the world's largest producer, is the key. Just briefly, in terms of the economics that Simon was talking about, what have we contributed to the climate change debate? Economics is a discipline based on the allocation of scarce resources. It was Milton Friedman who said there is no such thing as a free lunch. So the fundamental problem of maximizing welfare while respecting the constraint the planet places on us is a familiar one. But as I said, people interpret all this differently, It's not an easy problem to solve. The uncertainties are immense. The markets are not fully formed, and the timescale we're talking about here spans generations, and I talked about the problems that we see there. Also, I have to say that as economists, we have at times been seen as part of the problem. We're part of the awkward squad, which is slowing down the process of securing agreement on emission reductions because we like to analyse things. And I would say that being awkward is a good thing. I've always been awkward in my jobs. It is because we want to base policies on the evidence and having a clear and transparent analytical framework for decision making. And that, we believe, is the way to achieve consensus. But of course, every country comes from their own viewpoint, as I said before. But there's no justification, if that is the case, for individual countries or individual regions to act alone, just to be seen as first movers in this is not the way to influence what others do. It never works. It doesn't work on trade policy generally. It's unlikely to work in this area as well. And of course, if we do enhance our own attempts to have emission reductions without worrying about what everyone else is doing, then of course we have the problem of competitiveness and moving us all into slower growth without actually achieving anything in terms of global carbon reductions as output moves elsewhere. But some say that perhaps the solution for China and others is pursuing lower economic growth, or even in the West, stop pursuing economic growth as a way of keeping emissions down. I mean, I would say that such an approach is undesirable and unnecessary. If we are to develop the technologies and business methods that will decarbonize our economy, and we are to ensure that these are diffused and used widely around the world, including China, then this will only happen when enterprise all around the world is permitted to flourish and barriers to trade and mobility are removed. And the prospect of reward and material improvement have driven our economies for centuries, and I do not see a viable alternative in prospect. And furthermore, the best chance of assuring that China, India, and other emerging economies buy into international climate change agreements is to allow them to get rich enough for their citizens to care about their impact on the planet and its future. So we, from the West, must be constantly trying to remove barriers to the development and diffusion of low-carbon technologies to those countries. It means working more closely with China. China will, in my view, reach a point in terms of GDP per head where the environment and green is going to be very much part of their general industrial and strategic policy, and I think they're very close to it. And we have everything to win by actually working closely with them. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Vicky. Malcolm and George, would you like to ask Vicky any questions?
Yes, well, Vicky, thank you. Very interesting again. Again, didn't remotely address the question that we're supposed to be tackling. But I might, if I was slightly rude, I would say trust an economist to tell us it's all about economics. There is a political dimension as well, as you briefly mentioned. If you were going to Durban at the end of this year as part of the British delegation, what would you say to China to try to persuade it to be part of absolute cuts around the world rather than just emissions intensity cuts, which is what we're seeing at the moment from China? What would you say, what would be the persuasive argument you would bring from the UK?
Well, I'm afraid I don't really see how we can argue that at all. I mean, China is going to continue to grow, and it will need to, hopefully become slightly more energy efficient as it does that. It is still in a very low development stage. And of course we know that energy consumption increases with, that's the greatest correlation, with growth in the economy,
okay,
particularly with incomes. So basically you can't do anything in terms of trying to achieve actual cuts.
So your whole discussion about how allowing people to get richer will lead to environmental improvements is completely blown away by what you just told us.
No, it isn't. You can't necessarily achieve cuts in countries which are still growing.
It's already above the global average, 5.3 tonnes per capita.
Yeah, it will get considerably more efficient as it grows. The interesting thing for the world and for China is the way in which technology can then develop in a way that brings this improvements that we would like to see overall. And I think given that China is the greatest, we're going to be one of the greatest producers of anything really in the next few years, and already has proved to be the case in a number of areas. They're the ones where energy efficiency is going to have to develop. So I don't think we are in a position where we can already be talking about cuts in the global.
So at what point should China's emissions stop growing? How many tons per capita would be appropriate?
I'm going to cut you off there and ask that you answer that question perhaps later on in our debate.
Thank you. That's a relief. Thank you.